I'm Eric Seymour, member of the Adult Education Committee. Delighted to have here Sahar Verdi from all the way from Israel. She's a Israeli peace activist who's devoted her life to justice. She's tried, her views have landed her in jail for failing to agree to be conscripted in the occupation. She's a well-known speaker and activist, and we are absolutely thrilled to have her today. Without further ado.
High enough, or should I? A little higher. No, a little higher.
More.
Yeah, okay. The thing in my pocket. Is that any better?
Yeah.
No. Okay, I'll just speak. Project a bit better. I mean, this isn't the maximum, so I feel like let's see. That will make it, yeah. Just don't want you to hear me breathe too much. But does that work?
Yeah.
Is everyone okay? Awesome. So hi, nice to meet you all. Good morning.
Good morning.
I don't know if I failed to serve the bill. I feel like that's always a funny phrase.
Yeah.
No, I know it's a figure.
Consciously decided to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think often when I speak about Israel-Palestine and the realities on the ground, and I know that you all probably have questions and thoughts about what's happening currently on the ground, and I'm very happy to speak of them. But I think one of the things that's always important for me to kind of take a step back and say and start with is saying that hearing about the occupation and realities of Palestinians on the ground is not something you need me for. Right? As an Israeli Jew, I don't live under occupation, and obviously Palestinian voices are the ones who can tell that story in a much better way. And I think that what I can try to offer as an added value into that is speak a bit about Israeli society and what it is within Israeli society in many ways that allows the realities that we read about in the news of occupation, of ethnic cleansing, of things that we will talk about today. So that's just kind of as a framing of what I would like to offer. I obviously know that this will also go into other places. A lot of my life and activism is with Palestinian communities in the West Bank. I'm happy to also share about that, which is to say where I kind of will come from on a presentation level, and hopefully we'll have more of a time for a conversation after that. So that's just kind of to set the scene, and I think for me one of the most important things, or a most helpful framework to talk about Israeli society and understand the politics but also the sociology of our society is to talk about militarism, is to think about militarism. And obviously that's a very relevant thing in this country as well. And that's parallels that I'm hoping that we'll be able to draw out in this conversation, because Israel is far from being alone in being a militarized society. But I think Israel is in many ways, and usually when there's these like international meters of what are the most militarized society, Israel is usually very much at the top there. Because there is conscription, which is obviously a very militarized policy. Israel's military economy is extremely strong. Israel is one of the 10 biggest exporters of arms in the world every year in absolute numbers. If you think about that in comparison to the size of the state, that is crazy. I mean, it is by far the largest exporter of arms when it comes to GDP and things of the sort. And it also just is a society that its norms and its values are extremely militarized. And I think it's important to understand the history of that a bit and how it is constructed, and look at the ideology of the state, Zionism, and what its relationship with militarism is. And on that, I think I'll actually start by asking you all a question. You've all heard different narratives about the state of Israel, why it exists, why it has the right to exist, and without going into your own politics and what you actually think. I would like to hear when you think about why does the state of Israel exist, or right, why does it have a right to exist? What are the answers that are usually given around that? A safe haven for Jewish people. History was said.
God gave it to them.
God gave it to them. What about history?
Well, the biblical history,
Right?
The Holocaust history.
The Holocaust history. So mainly we have kind of two forms of narratives. There is the religious narrative, the historical one about God gave it to us, as well as, I mean, that's both religious and historical, right? The people who were there thousands of years ago. And then the modern day one, which has to do with the safe haven, the Holocaust, all of that coming together. And those are the two main narratives of the state and its creation. It's important to say that for early Zionists, there was a different narrative that we hardly talk about. For early Zionists, the narrative was about European nationalism, right? It was before the Holocaust. There was persecution, obviously, of Jews, but it wasn't a time of specific increase generally in persecution. It was a time of an increase in nationalism, European nationalism, and a feeling of, well, in that context, we want to duplicate that as well. But that's a narrative that almost doesn't exist today, right? That's not what we think about. I think that what is interesting about the narrative that does exist, and in many ways that won, if I put the religious part aside for a moment, we'll get back to it, the kind of recent history aspect of it, the safe haven aspect of it, has a lot of hidden layers. Why is it? What is the connection between the Holocaust, or the need for a safe haven for Jews, and a state? What's that missing link? Truth. Right. In that narrative, accepting that narrative, or trying to find an explanation. What are we not saying in the middle?
Well, European countries passed laws that use the power of the state to discriminate against Jews.
Right. So a lot of when we think about state, we're thinking about a law that doesn't allow that, right? But that then is true, legally speaking only. I'm not talking about social society and how it's implemented yet, but that's true here in the States, relatively speaking. And it's true in a lot of liberal democracies, obviously not in what Europe became in the middle of the 20th century. But I think another thing that we often miss, and that was actually very dominant in the Zionist narrative, is that when we're talking about a Jewish state, we are talking about Jews doing that thing that states do of a monopoly of violence, right? We're talking about monopoly of violence is kind of how sociologists often speak about what is it that the state does with a military and a police force and so on, that the state says, I am the only one who is allowed to use violence. And I think that is very much what lies underneath this narrative of a Jewish state as a safe haven. It's about having Jews having the ability to physically protect themselves. The military in many ways is a core part of why there is a need for a Jewish state in that narrative. Right? A Jewish state, a demilitarized Jewish state, in that sense, doesn't do that thing. When people say we need a safe haven, we kind of mean we need our own army. And I think it's important, we have that in our heads, it's kind of obvious when we think about nation states today, that the army is a big part of them, but that wasn't always the case historically. So I think it's important to just place that in a minute. When we talk about a Jewish state, we're also clearly talking about a Jewish military. And that's the important part in the safe haven. And we feel that until today. Like that narrative is still a huge part until today. But it's a very new narrative for Judaism. The idea that the way to combat anti-Semitism or to combat persecution of Jews is a militarized solution is a very, very new concept to Judaism. If you think about thousands of years of Jewish history, there have been a few moments in which the way to deal with persecution was armed mutiny, those are very few. And if we think about Jewish diasporic history, those almost don't exist at all. And there's been a lot of other Jewish mechanisms to deal with persecution. And some of them were about isolating and being in kind of segregated communities at times, and other times it was about becoming more mixed up with other populations, assimilation. There's been a lot of different tools that have been used, and we see that until today around the world. But the idea that the solution is militarized is a very new one. And today it is almost the only one that still exists in narrative, which for me is crazy. That a narrative that didn't exist 100 years ago is almost the only one we can think about today. If we think today about any form of attack, especially against Jews, I think one of the very clear examples of this was in the Pittsburgh shooting, which was, I guess, a decade ago now. In the synagogue, sorry, this keeps falling off. In the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and it was really interesting to see kind of what were different reactions. This was in the first Trump administration. Trump's first reaction was to say that synagogues need security guards at the entrance to them, right? Here's a militarized solution for you. Netanyahu's first reaction was, this is a reminder of why the state of Israel needs to exist and why Jews need to move here. Yet another militarized solution. And the Jewish community in Pittsburgh's response was none of that, right? It was a lot about rebuilding. It was a rebuilding specifically also with a local mosque. It was about reading the political thing that happened there, both as anti-Semitism but also xenophobia. The event that was being attacked was one of an organization supporting immigrants. Like, it was very clearly a completely different way to respond to, right? This is still a response, but to respond to an anti-Semitic attack. And I think that just kind of remembering that those are choices that are being made is very important, because the main thing that I can say today about Israeli society is that we don't see that. We don't see that choice as existing. We only have one narrative of how to protect ourselves. A non-militarized one just does not exist. And it makes us as a society blind. Blind and one that cannot move anywhere. I think that for me, I mean, obviously the last 2.5 years, a lot of processes within Israeli society have accelerated, but I really remember this feeling on October 8th, October 9th, 23, when, I mean, obviously we were all hurting, trying to find out who do we know. It was a very real and raw moment of fear, right? Of a lot of fear. And there was hardly anyone who was, I mean, including among my friends, who are generally, liberal lefties, hardly anyone who managed to think of any form of response that is not bombing Gaza. Like, it wasn't even a moment of, and you're saying, I mean, a society just went through trauma. It's still licking its wounds. It doesn't know who's alive, and like, nobody even had time to count the dead before the assault in Gaza began. And that kind of automated response is part of saying there is only one response, right? If there's only one response, you don't need to think about it. You don't need to stop and say, what is my policy here? And if someone would have stopped and said, there could have been a lot of other different policies, right? And a lot of other questions that would have arose from that. But as a society, we don't need to do that. All we need to know is that if we have a solution to this idea that if someone tries to kill us, what do we do? And we need to be stronger. We need to bomb back. We need to kill more. And I think on a kind of basic level, it is important to understand that about Israeli society, because I think that a lot of the way that we think about politics outside of Israel, in countries that are still extremely militarized, and still that's part of their discourse, but it's not the only part of their discourse, is that then we try to understand decisions of the Israeli government or reactions of Israeli society in the kind of rational tools that we have outside of there, not based on that fundamental fear and that automatic response to it. And again, none of this is to justify that response in any way. It's just, I think, important to understand it, to understand then what do we do with it? How do we combat it? So that's one thing that I think is important to understand about kind of Israeli militarism and where it's at. But I think the other thing is that in the last few decades, it has also shifted quite a bit. And from a place that a lot of the creation of Jewish Israeli identity or Zionist identity was based on fear. Another trend has risen dramatically, and that is including superiority in that. Now, superiority has always been part of the Zionist narrative. Again, we're talking about a national European movement that came with all the white supremacy ideas of national European movements. And it came to the Middle East with a colonial mindset. Like, it's always been part of it. But there was the much stronger narrative was we're doing what we're doing because we have to, because if we don't fight back, we'll be killed. It was much more based on fear. That was kind of very much the main dominant narrative. And I feel like in the last few decades, as fear became rationally less and less relevant, I'm taking the last 2 years, putting them aside for a moment, but for the lived experience of most Israelis, we have the power. That is the reality, right? And sure, there still are intifadas, there still are Palestinian uprisings, but for the most part, our lived experience doesn't need to be fear in the same way. And while that narrative still exists, what happened with that is the building of a much clearer narrative that is okay with supremacy. It's not just internal white supremacy, it's okay to be, and in this context, Jewish supremacy. It's okay to actually believe that Jewish lives are worth more. And that is a very clear reality today in Israel. That we have both those narratives. Everything that we do is because we are victims, but also we understand that we are victims that now have all the power and have the right to have all that power, and that is a discourse that is just acceptable. And with those two things, I think understanding the genocide of the last 2 years becomes much easier, right? Because October 7th happens, the instincts of we have to protect ourselves kick in, and once that's already happening, the feeling that we have the right to take lives because otherwise somehow it'll be at our expense, and that other lives don't matter as much, is almost built in to the DNA of the society. It kind of made sense within that discourse. And I think it's, like, for me, I mean, for years, you know, as a Jew, as an Israeli, we grow up with narratives of Holocaust, obviously, and everyone always has this conversation of, like, how is it possible? The other Germans, what were they thinking? What does it mean to be in a Nazi society? What does it mean? Like, we all have those questions, and I think we all have those questions everywhere we are, right? And we have parts of answers, but then living in a society that is going through that process historically for many, many years, but within these last 2 years of shifting into a place where you can have a conversation with a normal person, someone who's in the middle of the political spectrum, and talk to them about kids being killed by snipers, right? The least accidental thing you can possibly think about. And for them to just be able to say, well, we don't have a choice. That's how it is crazy, right? But it's a crazy that if you think about that process, makes sense. And that's a terrifying thing to think about a society. And for me, about a society that I live in. But I think that's the work that I need to do, right? As an Israeli, trying to think, how do you deal with that society? How do you function within that society? But the reason that I think that it's important to kind of understand it and think about it globally is, first of all, definitely not, like my aim is not to dehumanize us as Israelis, right? That's not the point. But there is a point of saying there is no reason, we're not different than other societies going through these kind of processes in different moments of history. But none of those societies could have been expected to change on their own, and that is also true for us. There is no reason to expect that enough education and goodwill or anything of the sort will make us wake up and break narratives that we grow up in since we are born. That's not a reasonable expectation. So when we think about how do we end genocide, how do we change policies, how do we affect change, then I think understanding where Israeli society is at is actually important to understand, or to remind ourselves that that's not where change will come from. Not to say it can't change. Israeli society can and will change. All societies do. And in the political constellation in which, however that looks like, occupation ends, Israeli society will shift. But history has taught us that that's usually the order of things. Structural change happens before societies can actually change as a society. And that brings us the question of, what does structural change look like, and how do we bring that about, and what is our responsibility about that? And for me, again, coming from a person who studies militarism, that's kind of my main field of work, it is important to think about pressure around Israel also in terms of militarism. As I said before, Israel's military economy is extremely strong, one of the biggest exporters of arms in the world, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard over the last 2 years that there's been a lot of conversations about arms embargoes against Israel, and some countries that have decided not to ship arms or sell arms to Israel because of the genocide. And that included even the US for about 5 seconds, of saying, we'll slow down shipments for a while, but a lot of European countries that have said that they would. There's the Hague Forum, which is a group of 22 countries that was led by Colombia. 12 of those countries have already said that they will have a complete embargo, arms embargo in Israel. Spain has said the same. The UK has shifted some, or stopped some of the shipping of weapons and so on. And that looks like something, and I'm not saying it isn't at all relevant, it is, but I think that one of the interesting things that happens when we talk about an arm embargo in Israel is that we only talk about one direction of it, and that is not sending arms to Israel, which obviously is easier to explain. Like, we are now seeing rockets killing children, we will not send those rockets. But what is hardly spoken about, and is continuing on, not to the same level as before the war, but increasing dramatically since the war, is buying arms from Israel. And that's slightly less intuitive. It's not as fun of a campaign, right? You can't make the connection as easily and say, well, these are our bombs, don't bomb people with them. But there's no real difference, right? Buying arms from Israel is making sure Israel has the money and the industrial capability to produce arms that it will then use itself as well, right? And that's a conversation that's hardly happening. And I think we can't really think about how do we challenge Israeli military economy without that. It is the one part of Israeli economy or Israeli export that has increased over the last 2 years. Everything else in Israel's export has decreased, as happens in war economies, and there's also much more quiet boycotts of a lot of Israeli goods that's happening, as well as some public ones. But the one export that is constantly increasing is military export, which today is at $14.7 billion. It was at around 12 before the war. It's an 18% increase, which is crazy in a world that says that it is trying to hold Israel accountable for its crimes. And so for me, I think that's a really important thing to be talking about, to be thinking about when we think about how we challenge these systems. And to remember that this is not just a profit for Israel, but this is also true for many US companies that are still selling their arms in Israel and making a huge profit out of it on a daily basis. And so this also is not just a question of how do we affect change, but also what is our responsibility within that change. So I think that kind of as a, I don't know how I'm doing with time, but I think it's kind of a setting the scene of what I think is important for us to be thinking about structurally. That's kind of most of the introduction that I wanted to give, and I would be happier to turn this more into a conversation and hear what your thoughts are and what are things that are interesting for you about both what's happening on the ground, but also about kind of what we can do around this and how do we mobilize around this. And I know that this is a moment that mobilization in the US, I'm not from here, so forgive me because my knowledge comes from my very, very specific social media feed. But I do know that there's a moment that's happening here, movement-wise, and if I think about kind of anti-militarism movement generally, around ICE and mobilization against ICE, that is both complicated or takes attention from a lot of other struggles, but also is something that is both urgent, but also, I don't want to use the word successful because that's a bit much, but also working. Communities are mobilizing, things are moving, and it's a moment that I think is also very important and interesting on understanding, first of all, our agency in actually challenging these huge militarized systems. And especially in a world where so many leaders, and this is a good example of a place like this, but so is my home, where so many leaders are these like strong men, I'm going to decide whatever I feel like, this is just going to be policy now. And there's something about that is very discouraging, because all the systems that we think of protesting and calling our Congress members and all of these things that we kind of build into feel like they don't work as well in the context of that kind of politics. And yet this is a moment where mobilization on the ground, just people saying we will not be silent as our neighbors are being taken away, is managing to be effective. And I think that that's just, for me, coming here now is kind of an interesting moment to visit and possibly also learn from you about those challenging of militarism and where do we have some of those entry points. Please.
Are there any leaders in Israel these days that are willing to talk to Palestinians and set up a different kind of reality?
Any leaders?
In Israel?
I think it depends on our definition of leaders. But political leaders, no. The short answer is just no. We are coming up to an election that will be the latest in November. And the kind of leader of the so-called, I don't know, liberal camp, I don't even know what words to give it, came up with a campaign just 2 months ago saying that they will build a government without the radicals, giving Ben-Gvir and kind of the extreme Israeli right as the radicals from one side, and the most moderate Palestinian party in Israel, Ra'am, by far the most moderate one, as the radicals from the other side, right? We're talking about a right-wing politician who is publicly promoting ethnic cleansing and genocide, who is convicted of terror himself, who is, all these crazy things, his equivalent is a very moderate political party that happens to be Arab, right? So no, and that's the so-called leaders of the liberal camp. Within the political system today in Israel, there is nobody that actually gives an alternative voice. There are plenty of alternative voices within Israeli society, but they are small, marginalized, and do not fit in to existing politics. And yeah, please.
Two things in the news recently. In the famous Tucker Carlson interview, Mike Huckabee said there's 700,000 Americans in Israel. The other thing that was in the news was the thousands and thousands of Americans that served in the IDF. How should we react to that?
That's a great question, and I actually don't know enough about U.S. legislation, if there's any potential. There are some countries in the world that have legislation around, or restrictions around serving in foreign militaries, and even more so serving in foreign militaries while they are complicit in war crimes. But even without that form of legislation, it does mean that there are war criminals walking around you, right? Which I know for me is true. But they are also, many of them coming back here and walking around here. And I think that that's a great question of what do you do with that as a society? And if and how you make that present. And again, I think that the legal options within the United States are not going to be, probably not going to be the solution currently. The way that the legislation is done, I mean, I hope that changes, but for now. But there's questions of society, of how is society going to respond to these people. And I don't have an answer, but I think it's a very important one. I think it is also important to say there are a lot of these dual citizens, U.S. Israeli citizens. A lot of them are immigrating to Israel. And a lot of the ones who came to serve specifically are also going to likely stay. And we do see that happening quite a bit. And that's, I mean, I think that that's specifically an important thing for the Jewish community here to understand, because these are obviously people who grow up in the Jewish community, of understand how do you manage to break the Zionist hegemony on Jewish education. And that is a shift that's been happening very drastically in the last few years. And the Jewish American population is moving on the issue of Palestine dramatically. And I think it's really important to kind of see that and recognize that. And at the same time say, and there's a lot of spaces where it isn't yet, or isn't able to reach yet. Yeah.
Thank you.
Please.
Since,
I apologize to the camera woman that I hope that's okay.
you're an activist, and there's been no real parties of support that have come to be. How do you move through this situation with hope? And so what is your idea of the way forward?
Hope is a complicated word for us currently. Over the last couple of years, I think I've had a lot of conversations with friends about it. And I used to say that when activists tell me that they are not optimists, I don't believe them. Because if you're an activist, then you are. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing anything, right? You must hold some hope. And I've been challenged on that quite a bit in the last couple of years. And a few friends offered me a different paradigm and said that it's a bit like The Plague, the book, and kind of the idea that the doctor will continue to try and help people, knowing, like having absolutely no power in the plague, or even believing that the plague will end at any point, knowing that everything he's doing is just a drop in the sea and not even. And he has many conversations throughout that book that mainly what he says is there's a point where you do something just because it's the right thing to do. and for no other reason. And that, for me, is something that I've been struggling with. Are we at a point where we're saying, actually, I don't know if there's hope in my activism. I still think it's the right thing to do. I'm still going to do it. But I don't know if hope is a word that I can still hold on to. And then I challenge myself around that. Because I think, there's moments, even here in this country, right? If just a couple months ago, I think there was a lot of feeling around kind of ICE and deportation and stuff like that. Hope was not a word. Like, sure, you'll still resist in whatever way. But then enough people do that and something moves, and hope is still a big word, but things change. And there's movement. And so for me, that's where I play around with hope at the moment. But I think that one of the important things to understand, and I think that this is very, very core to Palestinian resistance and always has been, is also, first of all, thinking in different time frames than we're used to thinking in like the longevity of the conversation. I think that a lot of us in kind of a more capital individual world we want to, when we think about hope, we think about changes we can see and in time frames that we can see. And I think that is one of the many things that we can learn from cultures who haven't gone through that individualization process as strongly, is that's definitely not the only paradigm. And if you think about Palestinian communities and speak to them about hope is not a good word, but about thinking about their presence in the land, they don't have that many question marks about it. It's clear that if you just stay, and this is where resilience becomes the main form of activism, and Sumud, like the Palestinian concept of Sumud, is so central, and I think in many Western eyes often feels a bit passive. This kind of just resilience, just being on the ground. But then you think about it and you're like, that is resistance, and a very hopeful resistance. I was talking, again, this is very, kind of, the context is terrible, but I was talking to a Palestinian friend who's a citizen of Israel, from the Communist Party, and he was asked exactly about this, about kind of how do you keep hope about this in the middle of annihilation. And then he said, in the Nakba, like we went through this, right? And in the Nakba, 700,000 Palestinians were displaced from historical Palestine. And I am one of the few families, he said, I'm one of the few families who stayed, right? And today that's 20% of the population in Israel. Like that's a population that grew in the last 70 years, even though originally there was a clear policy of ethnically cleansing them from what is now Israel. And just having that kind of thought about is for me very powerful. There's something that you'll hear many times Palestinians say, but just a couple of weeks ago there was in Safariyata in the south of the South Hebron Hills, in a community that a new outpost was just built there a few months ago, and they're terrorizing them every day, and there's kind of like daily issues, and there was a day that all the women decided to come out and just kind of make noise when the settlers came in, so all the women of the village came out, and then one of the women told the settler, like, you can continue coming, you can do what you do, you can use all the violence that you use, but you're just gonna lose because I'm not gonna leave. And obviously that's not always a choice, and Palestinians are leaving, and communities are leaving, and I mean, we see what happens in Gaza, like, that's not always a choice, but it's also true at the same time. And we, like, there's 7 million Palestinians on the land. 7 million people who will say, I'm not going to leave, I mean, as a core idea, and again, even if some of them will leave and some of them will, the core idea, they will be there. Palestinian presence on the ground will exist, and people with time grow And that is something that I think is very important. And again, I don't know if hope is the right word for it, but it's there, it's real. Please. Yeah.
This is a age-old question, but as somebody who is there on the ground, what does peace look like to you? Like, what does it actually look like for both the Palestinian people and the Israeli people to both be honored and protected in a peaceful way in that region?
I think there's 5,000 options for that, like practically what it looks like. I mean, I think it can, I'll start by saying peace is a nice big word, but any solution that we talk about is a temporary one, because any human structures are temporary, and it's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be completely just, and it's not going to be all of that, but it can be a stepping stone to continuing the struggle. So that is one thing that's important for me to say. Any way that it looks like is just a step in the way of what it then could look like from there. And on that level, it can look like two states that will have 5,000 problems with them, but it can be a step towards something else. It can look like one confederate state that has like cultural autonomies and lingual autonomies for different societies, and then see what happens after that. There's so many different frameworks of what it could look like, that I really think that a lot of the conversation just needs to be about saying there has to be political will to force it into. One of the challenges of that, and I want to challenge myself on that, because I think that for many, many years, that was definitely the political space I was in, of saying, I definitely don't need to be giving solutions. There's no reason why I, as an Israeli Jew with all the privileges, will be, this is the roadmap to what needs to happen. And saying our role is really to focus on making sure there is political will, there is leverage. I mean, any form of negotiation for 1 state, 2 states, 5 states, whatever. For it to be meaningful, it needs both sides to come with leverage. Israel has leverage, there's no question about it. So a lot of it is about saying Palestinian leadership needs leverage. And that's where us as an international community, or not us, you as an international community, can come in and say what kind of leverage can be supported. And I think that's still a good paradigm. I just think that one of the important things that is sometimes missed around that is the fact that currently there is no Palestinian leadership that could do anything with leverage. Not the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas of today, maybe Hamas of 3 years ago, but not Hamas of today. None of that exists. And so that is a place where I challenge myself about your answer, on what that looks like. And also a reason why I think that needs to, like, the release of Marwan Barghouti needs to be much more of a conversation globally, which it isn't now, because otherwise a lot of the forms of pressure and leverage and so on that we talk about can't translate. And I mean, not that, like, it's never about a specific person, but it is about symbols, and Marwan Barghouti is one of those symbols that actually can do something like that, so I think that that's an important part of the discourse. I also don't want to completely avoid your question, though, because while that is my political answer, on a practical level of what does that look like, it's easy. Like, I lived 2 years in Haifa now. Haifa is a city with a very high percentage of Palestinian residents, citizens of Israel, so at least legally speaking, we theoretically have the same rights. And it's not perfect, but it's fine. Like, if that whole piece of land lived like that, that would be a great start for something. And it's not difficult. Like, we think about the idea of Palestinians and Israelis living together as if it's this crazy thing that the societies are going to need to go through so many processes to get to it. No, I mean, to get to a great place where everyone's happy, sure, but to get to a place where there's not that many processes we need to go through. Between 67 and the beginning of the 90s, there was actual freedom of movement between the river and the sea. Crazy, right? Under occupation, under military occupation, Palestinians could just walk in and out of anywhere in Israel for work and things like that. It just happened. People didn't need permits. And that was possible. Like, what is possible is so simple, just like letting people be. Turns out just works. But the structures are obviously not built in that way.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I recently read Martin Luther King's speech, The Three Evils of Society, which he listed as racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. And at the time, he was talking about the Vietnam War and his decision to start speaking out against it, even though many in the civil rights movement thought he should just concentrate on the civil rights movement. But he listed it as it's draining money from our social uplift programs, in addition to being morally wrong. So lately here in this country, there's obviously been more focus on local militarization of police forces, abductions and killings, on the street here in the US, but I think there's still very much a cultural attraction or acceptance of our international military, which I think most people know the size of our budget is equal to 10 other countries in the world or whatever. Culturally, I mean, the Democrats and the Republicans fall over themselves to add money to the budget, even more than what the executive might ask for. Personally, I experienced this at sporting events, where the hero of the day is always Lieutenant Colonel so-and-so, or Navy Superintendent such and such. It's never, and there's flyovers of the jets and red, white, and blue things coming out of the planes. It's never a nurse or a teacher or some other hero in the country. So it's very, it's a sort of a subtle message, not so subtle maybe sometimes, but it's there. And it's now, of course, we're discussing the local abductions and killings, but there's still that international presence that is so overwhelming. I'm not sure there's a question there, but it's just, I wanted to point that out, that this was talked about. I mean, Eisenhower obviously gave his speech about military-industrial complex, and that's sort of gone by the wayside. And I think it's something that people of faith need to recognize, that it's an evil in our society.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, and I think I was at the airport yesterday in Frankfurt, connecting to here, and then United Airlines have this announcement of first class or whoever come in, and soldiers, right? And then they add that it's not just military personnel or whatever they call it, and they add like, or welcome and thank you for your service, right? And I'm sitting in Germany, I'm just thinking, are they going to announce this in German now as well? Because it's going to sound very different once they announce that in German, which they don't. And in a lot of societies, that's still a weird thing to do, right? And still there is more criticism of what that means. And it's interesting to see that shifting as well. Germany is a very interesting place of seeing how fast that can shift in all directions, from a time where obviously military was sacred to a time where military was seen as something that needs to be controlled, and Parliament has authority over the military in Germany as kind of a way to prevent what happened to Irpin, to a time now where they're restarting conscription and moving back into that world. So we live in a world that has a moment of extreme militarization that has to do, as you say, not only with internal politics, but also with external politics. And it's amazing to me, it's interesting to me how much that is not a conversation here. I just kind of assume that it is from the outside, but I was talking to a few people in the last few days, a few people from here, about the fact that I was wondering if I should fly in or not, because I just flew in yesterday. And I was like, well, I just don't know if I'll be able to fly back. And it took people a moment to think, well, why? Why is this bother? And I'm like, because you, this country, might be bombing another country, which might affect my ability to go back home. Like that all, and that's hardly a conversation here. Like this is the only conversation in Israel in the last few days, because we'll see missiles out of it, and we're still also in a very cushioned place where we'll go to shelters and they'll still be fine, but at least it's a conversation that's obviously happening because missiles will fly. And here it's like not even a conversation that people are aware of, like that is a place where, I mean, the responsibility of this country still in global politics today. Like that is, and I know that everyone here is critical of it, and I know like it's not, I'm not trying to push blame, but there's a huge amount of responsibility in living in what is still the center of empire, even if that empire is crumbling, and understanding how do you challenge the military industry here, because it is devastating to the world. You had a question, then you, sorry.
I no longer have Israeli friends in Israel. They've all left because the people who I knew decided not to stay in Israel. But one of the things that one friend said in taking her children and moving to Canada was it's impossible, you know, the educational system has been so impacted by occupation that we just can't live here. So I'm just wondering, as somebody who went through the Israeli educational system, if you have any comments on how that militarization and indoctrination into militarization plays out through an educational system that still produces like a lot of PhDs and a lot of people who go through, you know, what you would think would bring about critical thinking and awareness. It's kind of a puzzle to me.
I feel like critical thinking is 80 or 90% of the time, it's critical still within a box, right? And that box changes. And within it, you can be very critical on things and also develop a lot of things and, yes, PhDs in a lot of subjects. But you still have these assumptions that are the box that you're in. And that is also true for Israeli society as it is for many others. And so militarism I mean, it's even funny to talk about militarism in Israeli education because you reach an education system only in the age of 4 or 5. And you've already been militarized so much before that, which is crazy. But militarism for education for me is like the fact that you walk outside of your door and there's just people in uniform and machine guns walking around. And that it's just in the train clear that if a soldier that looks like a combat soldier walks in and there's no seat, someone will get up to them and let them sit. And like those are things way before you get to education. But within the education system, it is very clear. I mean, obviously middle school and high school, I'll get there. By the time I'm done, I'll get there. Middle school and high school are the worst in this. There is a officer that's responsible for any high school so that they can ask questions about preparation for military service. There's kind of a boot camp, like basic training in the 11th grade that you go out with your classmates for a week to play soldier. And so there's a lot of things that are like very clear, but I think a lot of it is much more in how clear it is culturally. There was a school here in, I think, New York, possibly New Jersey, somewhere there, that a Jewish school that children of a friend go to, and that was just organizing kind of care packages to send to Israeli soldiers. That's something we do all the time, but that even exists here, right? And that's also militarism in education, right? Saying that this is what we value in life, this is what we want to send things to. And this friend was just organizing some parents to send care packages to refusers as kind of a way to balance that. But that's still kind of funny. Like, why would anyone in the U.S. be sending care packages to anyone in Israel for whatever reason? Like, it doesn't. But that's part of that same indoctrination. So, I mean, I could talk for 5 hours about militarism in Israeli education specifically. But there's also a really good report by New Profile that talks about militarism in universities specifically, that is up on their website. I think also in the English version already. If not, it will be in like 2 weeks. So you can check out newprofile.org for that report. I think it'll also be a good answer. Please, I'll stop. Here, is that good? All right, I'll stop moving.
For those of us in the 7th Congressional District who have an election right now, the newspaper, the local newspaper, tries really hard to be a good force for the truth. And until I read the latest edition, I didn't realize there were 2 candidates that are being supported by a totally Israeli, American group that is totally in support of Israel, according to what the Wednesday Journal said. So I don't want to vote for those 2 people. But then there's, 12 other people? There are like 14 people running for this seat. So I think, somebody asked, what can we do? This is a minor thing maybe, but we really have to educate ourselves to see who's taking money from whom and who's buying what. And maybe that's about the best we can do. In my condo building, we get together on Saturdays and just visit. So I mentioned that, but there were 3 people who were sitting there who were Jewish. And I don't think 2 of them liked what I said. One of them was fine. So now I feel like I need to go and talk to them really and see, what their position is or whatever. But it's been frustrating, not just from a Jewish point of view, just trying to figure out who the heck we should put into this position. So
Sure, and I think there's people here in the room that'll be happy to continue this conversation with you. More about local politics here.
Right. And tell me.
Please.
When Rebecca Levin spoke at LaSalle Street Church on similar subjects, one of the parishioners raised his hand and asked, could the U.S. do better at modeling owning our own settler violence and our own history, and stop taking down road signs that talk about either indigenous or enslaved or marginalized othered people, and create a culture of pushing back against white fragility, against a form of justifying our own militarism. Even our national anthem is more military than other countries. It's not hard to see. So that was Jerry's question, who had a long career with the WHO. I thought it was an interesting question. Is modeling, would it have an effect on the love of militarism? That, Germany has changed with acknowledgement stones and stuff, and like you're saying, there's left and right there. But would modeling help? The U.S., in other words, my grandfather, if I'm pointing the finger at Israel, which is a little bit dangerous, I have 3 fingers pointing back at me. Maybe I would clean out my own mess before trying to tell somebody else how to stop killing each other.
I mean, first of all, yes, and again, not just on that, right? The U.S. is responsible for so much of what's happening in the world as far as global militarism is concerned. Even in a much larger level. But yes, I definitely think it is important, but I think that there's always a complicated line there between what you feel like you can do on a local basis and what translates into political, but also political culture. And I am sometimes wary of things that are relatively more about kind of recognition and symbolic recognition, which is important.
Well, reparations is another word.
Exactly, but it doesn't actually many times change structures. It sometimes even just feeds into them, right? I mean, it was really strange for me in Australia that there's always the recognition of land when they begin talking, but I was like at an event where a former prime minister is speaking and doing a recognition of land. I was like, but do you know what you did as a prime minister about this land? So so the answer is yes, modeling, but beyond symbolism, modeling into actually structural change. And I feel like this is my time.
You got it.
You read body language very well.
It is time. Yeah, thank you very much. This has been very